Hey, welcome to Restoration. My name is Matt. So glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you are watching. We are continuing the scroll of Genesis as we spend a year through the Torah, 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it is foundational to understanding the God of Israel and his heart to bring all of creation back to himself. So, Happy New Year for this. Judaism's kind of fun because it was New Year in October. Now it's New Year again in January, so that's cool. I recently watched the amazing documentary on Disney Plus called Music by John Williams. And you know John Williams' music if you don't even realize you know it. He wrote the music for Jaws, Star Wars, E.T., Superman, Indiana Jones, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, Home Alone, Harry Potter, and so many more. And there's some of the most recognizable music that's ever been composed. And in the documentary about John Williams' music, they talk about him and George Lucas talk about how they were inspired by Peter and the Wolf. And Peter and the Wolf is a simple music composition for children to connect with music. And it's told a Russian story of Peter and the Wolf, and each character is represented by different instruments and different sounds. So Peter is the strings, and it's always in my head actually. It's do 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 do, and then the bird is a flute, and the cat is a clarinet, and so forth. And so the idea is that each character being a different instrument sort of plays a separate song, but when you connect all of the songs together and the characters appear in the story, it becomes a score or a full composition. There are these individual songs that stand on their own, but when they're played together with the themes of each character, it becomes a symphony. So in Star Wars, John Williams created these songs for different characters that weaved together those songs to form a score. So when certain characters appear on screen in Star Wars, they're accompanied by their theme, which is played by the orchestra. One of the coolest examples of what we're talking about is actually in another movie that he composed the score of, E.T. And as the kids are taking E.T. outside on Halloween, he's dressed as a ghost, and you see everything from E.T.'s perspective. And at one point, you see a kid in a Yoda costume who's walking past E.T. And what's so great is as Yoda passes, the orchestra plays the theme, the Force theme from Star Wars. And it's like this brilliant move that even if you've never noticed it, once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. And as we've been talking about throughout Genesis, the Torah works the same way. There's this overall melody, and there are these themes for each character that play throughout the story. And you catch the themes if you pay attention to the melody. That's what we've been doing throughout the series on Genesis. And you hear the character themes from Genesis throughout the rest of the Bible. Themes that show up through the Torah, the prophets, the writings, and into the New Testament, which is a collection of Jewish books from the first century. And these themes, if you pay attention, as you read and you reread the Bible, you keep running into these beautiful songs and their character themes. And one of the key themes throughout scriptures is suffering and brokenness, and you see it everywhere in the biblical narrative. As a people, the Jewish people, we hold two things in tension and have for thousands of years. One, this world is beautiful, and all of God's creation is tov meod, it's very good. And this world is ugly, and we experience evil, pain, suffering, and everything that is raw, everything that is bad all around us. Right? Tov and ra, good and bad, hyperlinks back to the tree of knowledge of good and bad in the Garden of Eden. Rabbi Menachem Mendel said this. He said, or he's quoted as saying, there is nothing so whole as a broken heart. You cannot live this life in this world without suffering and brokenness. And we must find wholeness through our brokenness and engagement with suffering. We walk in this mix of suffering and hope, light and dark. It's kind of all around us, tov and ra. In Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Haldir, who's an elf lord, is speaking to Frodo and the Fellowship, and he says this. He says, the world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places. But still there is much that is fair, and though in all lands love is now mingled with grief, it grows perhaps the greater. Like love grows when grief mingles with it. I had to call my daughter and ask her to explain that quote to me. In order to see it, we need to ask God for what I'm calling a Vayigash moment. This is what happens in the life of Joseph in the latter part of Genesis. If you don't know, Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. He's the oldest son of Rachel, the one Jacob loved most. And Joseph was sold into slavery by his 10 older brothers. That was bad. And he rules all the known earth as second to Pharaoh 22 years later. That's Tov. Good. He experienced much pain and suffering, and it helps form his character in adversity. So this week's Torah portion is Vayigash, which means he approached. And it opens as Judah pleads with Joseph not to keep Benjamin, their youngest brother, as a prisoner. And they don't even know that they're speaking to their brother Joseph. So it says, then Judah approached him and said, I beg you, my Lord, please let your servant say a word in my Lord's ear, and don't be angry with your servant, since you are like Pharaoh. Now at this point in Genesis, Judah doesn't know that he's speaking to his brother Joseph, whom he sold into slavery 22 years earlier. And in our Genesis series, we essentially, over the holidays, we skipped over Genesis 35 to 44, and there's a lot that happens. So I have to highlight some of it before we can understand what it means to have a Vayigash moment. But I promise, if you jive with me through all the summaries, we'll get to something that I think will be meaningful to you. At 17 years old, Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, has 2 dreams in Genesis 37. In both dreams, his 11 older brothers and his parents are bowing down to him. This makes his brothers hate him even more than they already do. Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel, the wife that Jacob really loved. And he had 11 sons through Leah and 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. In Jacob's mind, he treats Joseph like he's the firstborn, even though he's the 11th born. And so Jacob favors one son over the other. Well, that's a hyperlink to lots of stories that we walk through in Genesis. And these brothers have a rivalry, also a hyperlink to many of the stories in Genesis. And the older brothers want to kill the younger brother because of jealousy. Hyperlinks to more of the stories in Genesis. So Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers at 17. And they decide to throw him into a cistern, which is like a pit. And Judah, the fourthborn, suggests that they sell him to Ishmaelites that are passing by. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him. So Joseph is sold into slavery by his 10 older brothers. And the brothers then deceive their father. This should not be a surprise because, well, Jacob's a deceiver. And they tell him Joseph was killed by a wild animal. And all that's left is this nice coat you gave him, which is torn and found in blood, dipped in blood. So Joseph is sold to Potiphar in Egypt. Then in Genesis, the Joseph narrative pauses and it shifts to Judah, the fourthborn, the one who essentially will become the oldest. And Judah marries a Canaanite woman. He has 3 sons. He offered his oldest son to another Canaanite woman named Tamar. And then his first 2 sons die, but they don't have children. And he promises the youngest son to Tamar, but he doesn't keep his obligation. So she dresses up as a prostitute, and Judah gets her pregnant, doesn't know it's her. And then when he's found out that it's her, he says, you are more righteous than I. And then she becomes pregnant with twins who fight in the womb. Biblical deja vu, hyperlink back to stories in Genesis. I preached on this in a Ruth series actually earlier this year, and then we posted it during the holidays in this Genesis series just 2 weeks ago. You should go back and check it out. It's crazy. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, which is Joseph in Egypt, he works for Potiphar, but he's accused of raping Potiphar's wife, and so he's thrown into another pit, like prison. And in prison, he interprets 2 dreams. One is of the chief drinker, which is a great title, by the way, of Pharaoh, and the other is the chief baker. And Joseph interprets their dreams, and his interpretations come true, and the chief drinker is restored. Joseph says, please remember me when you speak to Pharaoh. And he goes, yeah, totally. 2 years later, he remembers. The chief drinker remembers Joseph because the Pharaoh has two dreams that need interpretation. So Joseph interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. There's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Egypt will have to save grain during the 7 years of plenty so that when the famine comes, they will be ready to provide for Egypt and the whole world. And the Pharaoh asks, well, where are we going to find someone like that? So Pharaoh said to his servants, can a man like this be found, one in whom is God's Spirit? Ruach Elohim, God's Spirit. Do you know this is the first time that this phrase shows up in the book of Genesis since Genesis chapter 1 and 2? And it's right out of Pharaoh's mouth. Joseph is filled with God's Spirit, and so they put Joseph in charge. The Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one as discerning and wise as you. And for the author of Genesis, these hyperlinks bring us right back to the tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra, good and bad, the ability to discern and use wisdom. And he says in verse 40, the Pharaoh to Joseph, you will be over my house, and all my people will pay homage to you, and only in relation to the throne will I be greater than you. Now, by this time, the scriptures tell us that Joseph is 30 years old. And he becomes second to Pharaoh in Egypt. And he's put in charge to oversee the 7 years of plenty, and they save food for the years of famine to come. 2 years into the famine, his 10 brothers who sold him into slavery show up to Egypt for food because there's a famine in Canaan, and Egypt is the only place with food. So, at 39 years old, 22 years after he was sold into slavery by his brothers, he's been in charge of Egypt for 9 years. And after 22 years, they show up and they bow down before him. Verse 8 of chapter 42. Though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams he had dreamed about them. 22 years after his two dreams, the dreams come to pass. It's funny because it's two dreams that got him sold into slavery, two dreams that get him out of prison, and two dreams that exalt him to rule the whole known world under Pharaoh. And the brothers have no idea who they're talking to because Joseph doesn't look like a Hebrew. He looks like an Egyptian. He's dressed like an Egyptian. He wears makeup like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. He even, cue the bangles, walks like an Egyptian. So he spoke to his brothers through a translator, meaning Joseph would speak in Egyptian to a translator. The translator would speak Hebrew to the brothers and back and forth. And so all along, Joseph could understand what they were saying. In fact, at one point in Genesis 42, he even hears Reuben, his oldest brother, say to his brothers in Hebrew, thinking he doesn't understand, didn't I tell you to not sin against the boy, but you didn't listen to me? And now his blood, all this is happening to us because we're being held accountable for what we did. And Joseph has to leave the room where he weeps in another room as they're talking about them, and they don't even know he speaks Hebrew. 22 years after they sold him into slavery. He keeps Simeon in prison, his brother, and he sends the rest back, and he says to them, look, you have to go get your youngest brother to prove that you guys are not spies. And his whole plan is to just get his youngest brother and get rid of his 10 other brothers. And they go home, and Judah has to convince their father that he's got to take Benjamin. But with Joseph dead, Benjamin is now the favorite son. Rachel died giving birth to him. Jacob says, if something happens to him, I will die. And Judah, the seed of promise, the one whom King David and Yeshua will come through, assures his father that he will take responsibility for Benjamin's life. On their return, Joseph's men informed the brothers, now 10 and 11 with Simeon, who's been returned to them, that they have to have dinner with the second to Pharaoh. And through a translator. He sees the brothers. Joseph sees the brothers, and he says, how's your dad? Is he still alive? Oh, great, he's still alive? Yeah, that's good. Verse 29 of chapter 43. Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, is this your younger brother whom you mentioned to me? And then he said, may God be gracious to you, my son. Then Joseph had to hurry out of the room because his compassion grew warm and tender towards his brother so that he wanted to cry. So he wept in an inner room. He went into an inner room and wept there. Then he washed his face and he came out and controlled himself. And he said, serve the food. Like, there's so much drama. There's so much tension in what's happening in this story. They still don't know. 22 years since they sold Joseph into slavery, and they still don't know that they're speaking to their brother. And he feeds them, and he doesn't eat with them because according to the Egyptians, it's an abomination to eat with Hebrews. So he then sits his brothers in birth order, which totally freaks them out because they ask among themselves in Hebrew, and he can understand them. How does this guy know how to seat us in the order in which we were born? He must be using some kind of divination. And he feeds them more food than they've seen in years because there's still a famine. And Benjamin is given portions 5 times larger than his brothers because this family's got a problem with favoritism. And I think Joseph's repeating the same things his brothers did to him. They were jealous of him, so they sold him into slavery. And I think Joseph is hoping that maybe they'll abandon Benjamin if they're jealous of him. So they do all the same. He kind of recreates all the same things. Because they abandon him, maybe they'll abandon Benjamin. That's all he wants. That's Joseph's plan. He's going to get rid of the 10 brothers, keep Benjamin, and then he's never going to have to see them again. So he tells his men he's going to send them home to fill their bags with grain and the money they used to pay for the food. And then he wants them to put his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. So it says, they left the city and did not get far when Joseph said to the one over his household, get up, go after the men, and when you catch up to them, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? Ra for tov. It's like Joseph saying, I have done all this tov for you. I've done all this good for you. But of course, we know it's all deception, and the whole thing's raw because he's just trying to get rid of them, rid of the 10 brothers. And he says about his cup he's stuck in the bag that they find in Benjamin's bag. He says, isn't this the one that I drink from? And even if he uses it, especially to discern by divination, what you've done is evil. He's saying to them as he's deceiving them. The word for discern by divination is nachash. It sounds like the Hebrew word for snake. It has all the same Hebrew letters as the word for snake. And he uses this cup for ra, bad, and he's deceiving like the snake in the garden with a word that sounds like snake. He's being very sneaky. It says in verse 15 of chapter 44, it said, what is this you've done? Joseph said to them, did you not know that men like me can snake, can discern by divination? Don't you know? This is what he's actually saying to them. Don't you know that I'm a man who is deceiving like a snake? Just like who? Just like our dad? Cue Paula Abdul. He's a cold-hearted snake. Look into his eyes. He's been telling lies. So Joseph says he's putting his plan into action. And he says in verse 17, he says, I'm keeping the one in whose hand the cup was found. He will be my slave. But the rest of you, go to your father in peace. Benjamin will be my slave. The rest of you can go back to your father. Well, he's his father too, but he's so disconnected at this point and so engaged in his own plan that he can even say, without any emotion, go back to your father, because I don't care what happens to you guys. But this is where it all changed. This is the Vayigash moment with the first verse of the Torah portion, Vayigash. Then Judah, Vayigashed. He approached him and he said, You can't do this. You can't keep Benjamin. If you keep Benjamin, my father will die, and it'll be my fault. And the word Vayigash, the root word for this word in Hebrew is nagash. And nagash means to draw near, to come close enough even to touch. Look, Judah's like, okay, we're all going to die, whatever. But he gets real up into Joseph's space, so close he could touch him. And he says to him, I cannot return to my father without my younger brother. What this Pharaoh doesn't seem to know is I already did that 20 years ago. And my father, we tore his clothes in mourning, and we've been mourning ever since. My father tore his clothes because we lied to him about what happened to his other son. And if something happens to Benjamin, the only other son of Rachel, his father will die, and I will be the cause of it again. And I cannot let this happen again. So verse 33. So, please, let your servant remain as my Lord's slave in the boy's place, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father, and the boy is not with me? I must see, else I must see the wrath that would come upon my father. This is a wild scene because Judah is offering himself in place of Benjamin. The very thing he did not do for Joseph 22 years earlier. And I think the last thing that Joseph expected Judah to do. Nahum Sarna says this, the one who has been responsible for the sale of Joseph into slavery, because Judah's the one who says, no, let's not kill him, let's sell him. Now unwittingly offers to become the slave of his own victim. Oh my gosh, God, listen to what I'm saying. The one who was responsible for the sale of Joseph into slavery is now offering to become the slave of his own victim, but he doesn't know it's his brother. And look at Joseph's response in verse 1 of chapter 45. Now Joseph could no longer restrain himself in front of all those who were standing by him. So he cried out, "Get everyone away from me!" So no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. But he gave his voice to weeping so that the Egyptians heard and all of Pharaoh's house heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph, is my father alive?" And his brothers were unable to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Guys, you got to catch what's happening here. They're speaking through translation. And I think before Judah's speech is even done, Joseph begins weeping in all of his Egyptian makeup and tells, his mascara's running, and tells all of his people in Egyptian, I don't know how to say it in Egyptian, but he says, everyone get out of the room to all of his Egyptian people. And out of nowhere in Hebrew, he says, Ani Yosef ha'od avichai. Ani Yosef ha'od avichai. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? What just happened? The brothers are scared out of their minds. They didn't know he could speak Hebrew. What he just said makes no sense. I am Joseph. Is my father alive? What are we talking about? And then Joseph said, "Please come near me." So they came near. I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into slavery to Egypt. And both of these words are forms of the same word that is the name of the Torah portion, Vayigash, to draw near. He said to them, draw near. And so they drew near, so close that they could touch each other. And Joseph was happy to let them all go and never see them again as long as he could keep Benjamin. And he even says to them, why don't you just go to your father in peace? But there's no peace if they leave without Benjamin. They would carry the guilt that they've carried for abandoning Joseph for 22 years. And it's also Joseph's dad. He's so disconnected. He says the coldest thing, just go back to your father. But Joseph has a Vayigash moment. A moment to get so close he can touch it. A moment created by God where he has a choice to face what is in front of him or run away and not deal with the pain. Judah drew near first. And now in proximity to his brother, he asks the older brothers to draw near to him, and they all draw near together. This kind of moment is not something we can create for ourselves. It's not something you can create for yourself. Only God could create Vayigash moments. And a Vayigash moment gives you a choice. The choice is to draw near so close that you can touch it, or withdraw and create more distance. A Vayigash moment happens when you have a choice to draw near so you're so close you could touch it, or to withdraw and create more distance. In the New Testament, Jacob, who also aka James, is the brother of Yeshua, but his name is Jacob after Jacob our father. And he asks, as the brother of Yeshua, he leads congregations of Jewish believers in Jerusalem after his brother rises from the dead. Well, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that Yeshua appeared to his brother after the ascension, after the resurrection, and after the ascension, because Jacob didn't follow his brother when his brother was alive, but apparently he appeared to him resurrected and showed himself to him. Yeshua died for the sins of Israel, and Jacob had to mourn the loss of his brother while leading communities that follow his brother Yeshua, because he rose from the dead, just like Joseph. And Vayigash is the word. In fact, Vayigash is the Torah portion that Jacob is thinking of in a letter that he writes to the Jewish followers of Yeshua. We call it James. It should be called Jacob because that's his name. So Jacob chapter 4 and verse 7, he writes, "Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, is meditating on the Torah portion of Vayigash. The Greek word is engidzo, and the translators of the Septuagint use this Greek word in Genesis for Vayigash. They translated Vayigash into engidzo in Greek. We're supposed to draw so close to God that we can touch him, and allow him so close that he can touch us, that he could change us, that he could fill us, that he could lead us to moments that we cannot escape his face. So Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, continues in James. He says, "Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." My friends, we all need a Vayigash moment at the start of this new year. And Vayigash moments give us a choice. They're opportunities to humble ourselves and let God lift us up, to draw near so close that you can touch the Lord, or withdraw and create more distance between you and God. The truth is, the longer you avoid what the Lord wants you to understand about yourself, the longer it will take to find wholeness in your heart. Brokenness is this theme that we see all throughout the scriptures. It's like this sweet theme song in a larger melody of the story. As a people, the Jewish people, for thousands of years, we hold two things in tension. This world is beautiful, and all of God's creation is tov meod. It's very good. And this world is ugly, and we experience evil, pain, and suffering, and everything is raw. Everything is bad all around us. God has to break us. He has to work through our suffering to help us find healing, because there is nothing so whole as a broken heart. And if you're far from God, you need a Vayigash moment to move towards him. He wants to be so close you can touch him, and so he could touch you. And the same is true with people. If you have broken relationships that you want healed, you need a Vayigash moment to move towards people and pray that God will make them draw near to you. You need to pray that God would lead you to opportunities to make your heart whole through your brokenness, to humble you because he wants to heal you and make you whole. So I want to encourage you to ask the Holy Spirit, where is there distance between me and you? And to ask the Holy Spirit, where is there distance between me and the people I love? And then I want to encourage you to pray this simple prayer. Lord, I need you to move. Please give me the courage to wait for a Vayigash moment from you. And give me the strength to draw near when it comes. In Yeshua's name, who died and rose from the dead, just like Joseph. Amen. I love you guys, and if you have an experience where the Lord draws near and does something, gives you a Vayigash moment, would you send an email to amen@shalomseattle.com, amen@shalomseattle.com, and just tell us a story of a Vayigash moment that the Lord opens up for you. We have one more week left in the scroll of Genesis, and then we're going to roll right into the scroll of Exodus. So I hope you'll hang with us as we continue through the Torah in 2025.